They thought they knew him, a quiet grandfather, a man of simple routines and modest means. But after his funeral, one locked door in his Vermont farmhouse changed everything. Behind the padlocks and dust was a basement no one had ever seen. Ledgers of hidden debts, letters stamped confidential, photographs with faces cut away, a safe filled with gold, and a bricked-up chamber untouched since the war. What secret could he have guarded so fiercely that even family was kept in the dark? And when the truth finally surfaced, would they dare keep it or bury it forever? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The funeral had been small, just as Thomas Whitlock would have wanted. A scattering of neighbors, a handful of distant relatives, and his children who had long since moved away, returning now more out of duty than closeness. The old man had lived alone for nearly 20 years after his wife passed, and during that time he became a fixture of the countryside. Quiet, self-reliant, and a little strange in a way only old men with too much land and too many habits could be. When the service ended and the mourners drifted back toward their cars, what remained was the business of his estate, a crumbling farmhouse crouched at the end of a gravel lane in rural Vermont. The house had been built sometime in the late 1800s, though no one could agree on the exact year. The clapboards had been painted white once, but decades of weather had stripped them down to gray. The roof sagged in places where shingles had loosened, and the porch leaned just enough to creak under the weight of anyone stepping onto it. It was not a house that invited warmth or comfort. To the family standing in the yard, it looked more like a burden than an inheritance. The upkeep alone would cost more than it was worth. Yet for all its flaws, it was undeniably theirs now, and with that ownership came decisions none of them were eager to make. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of dust and with smoke that seemed to cling to every surface. Old curtains hung stiff at the windows, and furniture that had once been sturdy now sagged with age. It was not a place that welcomed conversation, and so the family kept their voices low as they drifted from room to room, opening drawers and cupboards as though searching for some clue about what their father had left behind. Most of what they found were the expected remnants of a long life. Clothes folded neatly in dressers, shelves lined with jars of nails and screws, receipts dating back decades tucked into envelopes. But there was one detail that seemed to loom larger than all the others. At the far end of the hallway near the kitchen was a heavy wooden door fitted with a brass padlock. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Children who had grown up visiting the farmhouse in summers had never seen it open. They had asked once or twice what was behind it, and Thomas had given his usual short reply. "That's the basement. Nothing down there. You need to see." It was said with such finality that no one pressed him further. Over time, the locked door became a fixture of the house, just like the old stove or the iron bedstead in the guest room, an object that was simply accepted without question. Now, standing in front of it after the funeral, the family found themselves staring at the lock as though it were another mourner left behind. The basement had always been his alone, a space no one else had entered, and the fact that it was still sealed even after his death carried a weight that none of them could ignore. Eleanor, his eldest granddaughter, brushed her hand over the cool brass of the lock. "Strange, he never gave anyone the key," she murmured. Her father, Daniel, shifted uncomfortably and reminded her that Thomas had always been a private man. "If he kept it locked, it's because he wanted it that way," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The others debated quietly in the kitchen. Some thought the basement was probably nothing more than a workshop or storage space filled with broken tools and junk. Others, less convinced, wondered aloud what kind of man keeps a door locked for half a century without ever once letting his family cross the threshold. The secrecy, they argued, made the room matter more than its contents. It was no longer just a basement. It was a question that had gone unanswered for decades. Practical matters were raised. The will had been simple, leaving the house equally to Thomas's two children. They could sell it, though the property's condition would drag the price low. They could renovate, though the cost of repairs might bury them in debt. Or they could keep it, though none of them truly wanted to live in a house so full of ghosts. Yet every path seemed to circle back to that door in the hallway. If they were to sell, they would need to know what was behind it. If they were to keep it, they would need to clear it. If they were to demolish, they would still need to open it first. As dusk settled outside and the rooms grew dim, the basement door remained untouched, the lock glinting faintly in the fading light. The family's conversation turned to lighter matters, stories of childhood visits and summer dinners on the porch. Yet each time footsteps echoed in the hallway, eyes strayed back to the locked door. It was as if the house itself refused to let them forget that something waited below. Later, as they prepared to leave for the night, Eleanor lingered once more by the door. She tried the knob, though she knew it would not turn. The lock was old but strong, and it seemed to resist even the idea of being opened. She stepped back, unsettled by the thought that her grandfather had spent so many years keeping whatever was inside from ever seeing daylight. The others called her the car, and she forced herself away. But the weight of that silence followed her down the porch steps and into the cool Vermont night. The house stood dark behind them, windows blank, porch sagging, roof lined with moss. Yet in the stillness of the yard, the locked basement door seemed to hold more presence than the rest of the house combined. What Thomas Whitlock had hidden there, and why he had chosen to keep it from his family, was no longer a forgotten quirk of an old man. It was now their inheritance, and it was waiting. The farmhouse was quiet the next morning, though not with the peace of an empty house. It was a heavy quiet of a place unsettled, where every step across the worn floorboard seemed louder than it should, and the dust hanging in the light carried with it a kind of expectation. After the funeral, the family had returned reluctantly, each of them knowing the uncomfortable work of sorting through Thomas Whitlock's belongings could no longer be delayed. His presence lingered in every room, but it was strongest in the study at the front of the house, where his oak desk sat facing the window that overlooked the gravel drive. The desk was as old as the house itself, scarred from decades of use, its surface covered with a familiar clutter of his life. Yellowed receipts, fountain pens that no longer wrote, envelopes with stamps from years gone by. Eleanor, his eldest granddaughter, was the first to sit before it. She had always been the one to linger closest to him, the one who had listened when he spoke, even when his stories rambled into silence. She pulled open the drawers one by one, expecting only the detritus of a long life. Unpaid bills, brittle photographs, scraps of paper with half-finished notes. In the third drawer, beneath a stack of faded ledgers, her hand closed around something cool and solid. She drew out slowly, and the room seemed to still as the object caught the light. It was a brass key, heavy enough to feel purposeful, its surface worn smooth from years of handling. Along its shaft was stamped a single marking, 1948. Eleanor turned it over in her palm, the edges catching faintly on her skin, and felt the quiet weight of mystery that stretched across her entire childhood. "Everyone," she called softly, her voice carrying through the hall. Her father, Daniel, appeared in the doorway first, his tie loosened, his expression wary. Behind him came his sister Margaret, arms folded tightly as though bracing for yet another complication. One by one, cousins, aunts, and in-laws crowded into the small study until the desk was ringed with faces, all of them drawn to the key resting in Eleanor's hand. No one needed to ask what it might open. Their eyes drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the hall where the locked basement door waited. It had been part of their family story for as long as any of them could recall, a door that remained closed no matter the season or the occasion. Children had wondered, adults had speculated, but Thomas had kept it secret with the same sternness he carried in all things. Now the key had surfaced, and with it came the unspoken question of what he had hidden from them. Daniel took the key and turned it slowly between his fingers. "It must be for the basement," he said, though the word seemed less a declaration than an acknowledgement of what everyone already knew. Margaret shook her head, her voice sharper. "We don't need to open anything. The will was clear. The house is ours, and the best thing to do is sell it before we get buried under repairs. Whatever's down there, it doesn't change that this place is falling apart." Her words sparked the first wave of argument. Some agreed with her, pointing to the cracked plaster on the walls, the sagging roof, the endless list of costs that would come with keeping the farmhouse standing. Others argued that the key meant something, that Thomas had left it for them to find, and ignoring it would be like refusing a final message from the man himself. Eleanor listened as the voices rose and fell around her, the old study filling with the tension of family who had long since learned how to disagree. She looked at the key again, lying now on the desk among Thomas's papers. The date carved into it felt deliberate, not random. 1948. Decades before she was born. Decades even before her father had been old enough to notice the habits of his own father. What had happened that year to make Thomas seal away a part of his life? What had he decided no one should see? Her cousin Peter leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. If we open it, we could find nothing more than dust and junk. Old tools, maybe some food long gone bad. And then what? We'll have wasted our time when we should be calling realtors. His words carried the tone of someone who wanted the matter closed quickly, who saw the basement as an obstacle rather than a question. But Eleanor could not shake the feeling that the key mattered. The weight of it was unlike any she had held before, as though its very existence had been waiting for this moment, for their hands. She remembered the way Thomas used to sit at this desk, his back straight, his eyes distant, the faint smell of pipe smoke lingering in his clothes. He had been a man of habits, of rules, of secrets kept so tightly that even his children grew up in the shadows of them. Whatever waited in the basement, it had been important enough for him to lock away for more than half a century. The debate stretched late into the afternoon. Sell or open, forget or discover. Every voice carried its own reasoning, but the lock in the hallway did not bend arguments. It remained silent, patient, its answer waiting only for the turn of the key now lying in plain sight. When the family finally left the study to prepare supper, Eleanor lingered behind, her hand resting once more on the brass. She did not say it aloud, but she knew as surely as she knew her own breath. The house would not let them go until the basement was opened. The hallway to the basement had always been narrow, paneled in dark, with that seemed to swallow what little light filtered in from the kitchen. At its far end, beneath a bare bulb that hung crooked from the ceiling, stood the door that no one in the family had ever passed through. Even in childhood, when curiosity ran wild and rules begged to be broken, the basement had remained off-limits. Thomas Whitlock had made certain of that. He had spoken little, but the few words he gave were always obeyed, and none of the grandchildren had dared test his warning about the locked door. Now, with the old man gone and the farmhouse under their uneasy stewardship, there was no longer a figure of authority to enforce that silence. All that remained was the door itself, and the key they had unearthed in the desk drawer the night before. The door was heavier than it looked. Oak thickened with age, its surface scarred and dull but still unyielding. A brass padlock hung from the latch, its metal pitted but solid, the numbers on its shank worn by decades of handling. Dust had settled in the corners where it would met floor, gray layers untouched by sweeping hands for what could have been half a century. Eleanor crouched near the base, brushing her fingers across the floorboards, and the dust clung to her skin like a film, confirming what they all suspected. Whatever lay beyond had not seen daylight in years, perhaps generations. Daniel stood directly before it, the brass key in his palm, but he did not move. His breath was measured, his brow furrowed in a way that suggested he was weighing more than just the mechanics of a lock. Margaret leaned against the wall, her arms crossed tightly, her voice clipped. "We don't need to do this," she said. "We should just board it up and leave it for the next owner. No one keeps a basement sealed this long without reason. If it's rot or mold down there, we'll only be giving ourselves more work." Her brother shot her a look, not angry but troubled. "And if it isn't," he asked. The word seemed to hang in the hallway, unanswered but not forgotten. Speculation spread through the small group as it had the night before. Peter spoke first, his tone light, but carrying an edge of unease. Could be debts, boxes of receipts, IOUs. Maybe he kept things from a family, so no one would know how deep it went. His cousin Miriam shook her head, her gaze fixed on the lock. Debts don't stay hidden behind wood and iron. If he wanted to hide bills, he could have burned them. He kept something he wanted protected. That suggestion opened the door to darker thoughts. Contraband was mentioned, whispered as though the word itself carried risk. Old firearms, perhaps, or liquor from Prohibition days. Someone wondered aloud if Thomas might have hidden valuables taken from elsewhere, things he never had the right to keep. Another voice, quieter, suggested something worse, though no one dared give it shape. The silence that followed said enough, that each of them, in their own minds, had considered the possibility of a secret too heavy to bear. Eleanor placed her hand flat against the wood. It was cool, unyielding, and steady. "Whatever it is, he meant it to stay here," she said softly. "But he also left the key. He could have taken it with him. He didn't." Her reasoning fell into the space between them, undeniable but no more comforting than the lock itself. Daniel slid the key into the padlock slot, but it did not turn. He pulled it back, examined it, then tried again. The mechanism groaned but resisted, stiff with age. Frustrated, he pocketed the key and stepped back. "It might not even fit this one," he admitted. "Looks like he put more than one lock on it over the years." And indeed, closer inspection revealed more. Beneath the obvious brass padlock was another smaller hasp, its keyhole filled with a hardened plug of dirt. Along the jamb, iron brackets suggested earlier reinforcements, as if each decade Thomas had felt the need to strengthen his barrier further. Margaret's lips tightened as she pointed to the layers of metal. "That's not how people keep basements," she said. "That's how people keep others out." The weight of her words pressed heavily against them all. What had Thomas feared might come up from below? Or was it something he feared others might find if they went down? In the narrow hallway, with the bulb flickering faintly overhead, the basement no longer felt like a mere storage space. It pressed against the edges of imagination, swelling larger with each passing second of speculation. Eleanor backed away slowly, wiping dust from her palms. "We're not going to know until we open it," she said finally. "But whatever's behind this door has already started to divide us, and we haven't even seen it yet." Her eyes met her father's, and he understood what she meant. The basement was no longer just a place. It was a question that would not leave them alone until answered. The group dispersed reluctantly, some shaking their heads, others casting backward glances at the door as they moved toward the kitchen. The padlock remained, gleaming faintly in the dim light, as if it were aware of its role in holding the family captive to doubt. The whispers lingered long after the hallway had emptied, and in the silence of the farmhouse, the locked door seemed almost alive, waiting for the moment when someone would gather the courage to turn the key. The sound of the lock breaking was louder than anyone expected. It echoed to the hallway like a gunshot, sharp and final, a sound that seemed to shake dust loose from the ceiling and mark the end of years of silence. For a moment, no one moved. They stood in a half-circle before the basement door, each of them breathing a little quicker, each of them aware that what they were about to do could not be undone. Daniel still held the crowbar in his hands, the tool that had finally forced the rusted brass to yield. He lowered it slowly, his palms raw, and pushed against the oak with the flat of his hand. The door groaned, resisted, then gave way. The smell came first. It rolled up from the dark with the weight of something that had been trapped too long. Metal, damp earth, mildew, and something sharper underneath. Chemical, acrid, the kind of smell that burns the back of the throat. Eleanor covered her mouth with the crook of her arm and stepped back, her eyes watering. Margaret pressed her sleeve to her nose and muttered that they should leave it shut, that nothing good could come from a stench like that. But the door was already open, and the smell filled the hallway, clinging to hair and clothes, wrapping itself around them like a reminder that time itself had been sealed behind those planks. Daniel reached for the switch on the wall just inside, his hand hesitating over the porcelain knob. He twisted, but nothing happened. No hum of electricity, no bulb flaring to life. Whatever wiring had once run down there had long since died. The darkness yawned before them, complete and unbroken, and for a moment it seemed less like a staircase and more like the mouth of something vast. Peter fetched a flashlight from his coat pocket, clicking it on with a narrow beam that cut into the black. The first thing it revealed was the top of the staircase, wooden steps descending steeply, the treads warped with age. The walls were lined with pipes, some copper gone green with corrosion, others iron-streaked orange with rust. Shelves clung to the walls, sagging beneath the weight of jars whose contents had long since clouded into unrecognizable forms. The beam caught labels that had curled and yellowed: turpentine, kerosene, linseed oil. Some of the jars held powders that clumped against the glass, others liquids separated into layers of strange colors. The family lingered at the threshold, no one eager to take the first step. The air that rose from below was colder than the rest of the house, thick and damp, pressing against their lungs as they breathed. Eleanor gripped the railing, steadying herself. Her voice was quiet when she finally spoke. "He spent half his life down here," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "Whatever he kept hidden, this is where it lived." Daniel started down first, testing each step before shifting his weight. The wood creaked under his boots, but held. The beam of the flashlight slid across the walls, revealing rows of old tools hung neatly on nails. Hammers, saws, planes, wrenches, each one coated in a fine layer of dust yet arranged with care, as if waiting for their owner's hand to return. There was no chaos, no clutter, only the eerie order of someone who built a world in secret and guarded it fiercely. The farther they descended, the stronger the odor grew. The metallic tang clung to the back of the tongue, mixing with the sourness of mold. There were notes of oil and varnish, of soil damp with decades of seepage. But beneath it all lingered something chemical, sharper, a smell they could not name. Margaret muttered that it was dangerous, that they should turn back, but no one answered her. Curiosity had taken hold of them all, stronger than caution, stronger even than fear. At the bottom of the stairs, the beam revealed a wide room with a low ceiling. The stone foundation was exposed, rough and sweating with condensation. More shelves lined the walls, stacked with boxes marked in Thomas's careful handwriting. The handwriting was familiar, precise, almost architectural, but the words on the boxes gave nothing away. Dates, numbers, sometimes just a single letter. 1952, 1967. K.R. The labels were less explanations and hints, as if he had written them for himself alone. Eleanor stepped closer to one of the shelves and brushed dust from a box marked simply with 1948, the same year that had been stamped into the brass key. She hesitated, her hand hovering, but did not yet open it. The room was too overwhelming, the air too heavy, the sense of intrusion too sharp. She pulled her hand back, breathing through her sleeve. Daniel swept the light toward the far corner, where something larger loomed under a canvas tarp. The shape was indistinct, but the outline suggested machinery, tall and square, with dials protruding through the fabric. Pipes ran into the wall behind it, disappearing into the stone like veins. The tarp fluttered faintly as if stirred by a breath of air none of them could feel. No one spoke. The smell, the silence, the sheer weight of the space held them still. For years, a locked door had been a question without an answer, and now the answer was unfolding step by step, shelf by shelf, in the damp shadow of the earth. Whatever Thomas had sealed away, it was not forgotten junk or rotting firewood. It was deliberate. It was guarded. And now it belonged to them, whether they wanted it or not. The beam of the flashlight swung slowly across the basement, landing on the workbench that stretched nearly the entire length of the far wall. Dust coated everything in a thick gray film, but beneath it lay an order so precise that it seemed as if the space had been frozen in time. Tools hung from wooden racks, each one aligned with mathematical care. Hammers with handles darkened by years of grip. Saws with teeth still sharp. Wrenches of every size gleamed faintly when the light caught them. None of them had been tossed carelessly aside. Every piece had its place. Every place had its label, written in Thomas Whitlock's steady, unmistakable handwriting. Eleanor stepped forward first, her hand hovering just above the bench as if afraid her touch might disturb the fragile balance of the room. She picked up a small tag tied with string to a hand drill. In carefully inked letters, it read, "Purchase 1953, hardware store, replace bearing 1961. She sat down gently and turned to another item, a plane with a wooden handle. Its tag listed dates as sharpening. The last entry made in 1987. Thomas had not merely owned his tools. He had kept record of them as though they were entries in a ledger, a life tracked not in memories but in maintenance. Daniel stood in the center of the room, turning in slow circles. "It's like he cataloged his whole life down here," he murmured. His voice was low, reverent, though it carried the confusion of someone who had never been let into this hidden world. Margaret, less moved, folded her arms and shook her head. "It's obsession," she said. "Who keeps track of every nail and screw? Who labels their own tools like museum pieces?" But her voice lacked its usual bite, as though even she recognized the strangeness of the place demanded softer tones. Along the shelves stood boxes lined neatly in rows. Each one bore a label written in the same firm hand. Some were simple, asterisk nails, 1964, asterisk copper fittings, 1972. Others were cryptic, asterisk Project A, 1958, asterisk Trial 3, 1966. Do not discard. Eleanor brushed dust from one box and peered inside. Within were notebooks stacked edge to edge, their covers brown with age but still intact. She opened one carefully, her fingers trembling as she turned the first page. Inside, Thomas's handwriting filled every line in tidy script. Measurements, sketches, equations, and notes stretched across the pages, diagrams of machines she did not recognize, lists of materials he had ordered, references to books and journals she had never seen. She passed the notebook to her father. He adjusted his glasses and studied the drawings. They appeared to be some kind of mechanical schematics, cogs, levers, chambers. None of it made sense to him, but the detail was remarkable. He flipped through page after page, each one carefully dated in the upper corner. The entries spanned decades, beginning in the late 1940s and continuing into the 1980s, suggesting that whatever Thomas had been working on, it had occupied the better part of his adult life. Against the back wall, partially covered with canvas, stood machines that hummed with quiet menace even in their silence. Metal frames, gears, and wheels protruded from the shadows. Some bolted directly into the concrete floor. Pipes connected them to the walls and ceiling, leading into other rooms beyond. The family drew closer, the flashlight beam darting from one piece of equipment to another. Each machine bore a brass plate inscribed with numbers and dates. Some looked like lathes or presses, tools for shaping metal or wood, while others defied identification altogether. Peter reached toward one contraption, his fingers tracing the edge of a dial. The dial had been marked by hand with paint, its increments too fine for casual work. Beneath it, a tag read, asterisk calibrated 1969. Handle with care. Asterisk, he pulled his hand back quickly, unsettled. He was building something, he said. But for what? No one answered. The shelves nearest the machines held jars of powders and liquids, each carefully labeled. Some bore the names of common substances, sulfur, graphite, linseed oil. Others were marked only with initials or symbols. A faint chemical odor rose strongest from this corner, the same acrid scent that had hit them when the door first opened. Eleanor lifted a jar and held it to the light. Inside, the powder had clumped into hardened ridges. On the label was written, 1948, sample preserved. That year again, stamped like a signature across every hidden part of the basement. Daniel set down the notebook he had been holding and looked around the room, his face pale. This isn't just a workshop, he said. It's a record. Every tool, every experiment, every adjustment. He wrote it all down. He meant for someone to find this, or at least for it to last. Margaret shook her head but said nothing. Even she could not deny the atmosphere of the room. It was more than storage, more than the eccentric habit of an old man. It felt curated, almost sacred, as though Thomas had built not just a place to work, but a testament to his existence. Sealed away until the day his family would be forced to see it. The silence stretched, broken only by the sound of their own breathing and the occasional drip of water. Somewhere deeper in the foundation, dust clung to their clothes, the smell of oil and rust thick in their throats. Eleanor placed the notebook back into its box, aligning it carefully with the others. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. It's like he was building a museum for himself. A museum no one was supposed to see until he was gone. They all stood still then, absorbing the weight of that thought. Around them, the workshop seemed to watch, every label and ledger page a reminder that Thomas Whitlock had lived his life in quiet secrecy, crafting and recording with precision a man who knew his family would one day stand exactly where they stood now, wondering why. The basement did not give answers easily, but it gave enough to make them realize that what they had uncovered was not a pile of forgotten tools. It was a legacy deliberately preserved, waiting for its moment to be revealed. The box that held the ledgers was not tucked away in a corner or hidden beneath tarps. It sat on a middle shelf, square and plain, as though waiting to be discovered. Dust clung thickly to the lid, but the brass clasp on its front gleamed faintly under the beam of the flashlight. Eleanor brushed her hand across the surface, leaving a streak in the gray film, and lifted the lid slowly. Inside lay a neat stack of leather-bound books, each one identical in size, their spines cracked with age but intact, their covers marked with years written in steady, deliberate ink. Daniel took the first volume from the top. It was heavier than expected, the weight of paper swollen with decades of entries. He opened it carefully, and the musty smell of old ink and paper filled the damp air. The handwriting was unmistakable. Thomas's neat, measured script. Each page was a ledger line, columns ruled with draftsman precision, filled with numbers, names, and notations. At first glance, it looked like any record of accounts, the sort of farmer or craftsman might keep. But as Daniel read, the details sharpened into something larger. The earliest entries dated back to 1936. They listed small sums of money lent to neighbors, payments made for equipment, notes on which families had been struggling during the lean years. Each transaction carried Thomas's careful annotation, whether repayment was made, whether interest was forgiven, whether collateral had been taken. It was not a single man's budget. It was a record of the community, written in the same matter-of-fact tone one might use for tallying grain or livestock. Eleanor leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the inked lines. Names she recognized appeared in the margins. Families who still lived in the valley, their children and grandchildren sitting in the same pews at church. He kept track of everyone, she whispered. Every debt, every loan, even favors. As they turned the pages, the sums grew larger, the entries more complex. By the 1940s, there were records of investments, shares in local mills, timber rights, stakes in businesses that had long since vanished from the town. There were references to payments marked only with initials, some of them crossed out, others underlined twice. Margins carried brief but telling notes. Struggling, extend grace, not to be trusted, family must never know. Margaret took another book from the box, flipping quickly through its pages. Her lips tightened as she read aloud one of the notations. Payment to R.H. for silence, March 1948. She closed the ledger with a snap and set it down as though the ink itself might stain her hands. What was he doing? She demanded. What kind of silence did he have to buy? No one answered. They returned to the books with growing unease. Some entries looked innocuous. Payments to contractors, loans to neighbors in need. Others hinted at deeper entanglements. In the 1950s, there were repeated references to shipments received and forwarded, sums marked as unrecorded in official books. The language was vague, but the consistency was unmistakable. It painted a picture of Thomas not only as a man managing his own affairs, but as someone moving money, goods, and influence quietly, leaving behind only this meticulous private archive. Eleanor turned to a page dated 1962. It listed a loan given to a family she recognized, the Carvers, who had nearly lost their farm during that decade. In the margin, Thomas had written, "Never collect, let them keep their land." She traced the ink with her fingertip, struck by the contrast between the cold arithmetic of other pages and this single note of mercy. He wasn't just hoarding power, she said softly. Sometimes he protected people. He chose who got to survive. Peter, who had been silent, muttered from the corner, and who didn't. His eyes were fixed on another entry, one that showed a debt called in with property seized as payment. The family name scrawled that was familiar, neighbors whose land had mysteriously become Thomas's within a year. The room grew heavier as they pieced the fragments together. Thomas had not simply been an old man guarding tools and memories. He had been the keeper of debts, the hidden banker of the valley, recording every deal, every weakness, every choice to forgive or to demand. Protector to some, gatekeeper to others. His handwriting carried the weight of quiet power, exercised not through open declarations, but through decisions inked in margins, preserved in books no one was meant to see. Daniel closed the ledger gently and set it back in the box. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. He knew everything about everyone, he said, and he never told us. He carried this alone. Margaret shook her head, unwilling to let reverence soften the truth. He carried it because it gave him control. This isn't kindness. This is power. And he wanted to keep it until the day he died. The others stood in silence, the smell of dust and mildew heavy around them, the flashlight beam trembling slightly as it passed from one weary face to another. On the shelves above the box, the tools and notebooks remained, mute and orderly, but the ledgers had given them something else, an understanding that Thomas's locked basement had not been about secrecy alone. It had been about authority, about shaping the lives of others from the shadows, about being a hand behind decisions that echoed long after the ink had dried. Eleanor closed the box carefully and pressed the clasp shut. Her fingers lingered on the lid, as though she expected the weight of her grandfather's choices to seep through the wood. The workshop around them felt colder now, less a museum of tools and more a vault of secrets. Whatever else they found in the basement, they knew the ledgers had changed everything. The old man had been both guardian and judge, his legacy written not in stories, but in numbers, debts, and the invisible chains he had left behind. The cabinet stood against the far wall, taller than a man, their steel surfaces dull with age but unyielding. The flashlight beam glinted across their doors, revealing layers of dust disturbed only where fingers had once brushed against them. Unlike the wooden shelves and boxes arranged with care, these cabinets bore an air of finality. They had not been meant for casual access. Each one was fitted with a combination lock. Heavy dials rusted at the edges, yet still intact, their numbers faint but legible. The family drew closer, their footsteps hesitant on the concrete floor, as if entering a part of the basement that belonged more to secrecy than to storage. Eleanor was the first to notice the slip of paper taped unevenly to the central cabinet. The edges had yellowed, the ink had faded, but the words remained clear in Thomas Whitlock's deliberate hand. Knowledge is the only key worth having. She read aloud, her voice soft, the sound swallowed by the damp air. The words lingered like a riddle. One more puzzle left behind by a man who had spent his life building mysteries no one else was meant to solve. Margaret scoffed, her arms folded tightly across her chest. He always did love his sayings. Probably just a way to keep people out. Maybe there's nothing inside but junk. Her tone carried doubt, but her eyes did not leave the locks. Even she could not disguise her curiosity. Daniel stepped closer, running his hand across the cold steel. His fingertips caught in the shallow grooves where the metal had been scratched, perhaps years ago, when his father had turned the dials. He wanted us to work for it, Daniel murmured. He wanted us to earn whatever he put inside. Peter crouched near the base of one cabinet, inspecting the hinges. They were thick, bolted deep into the frame. Even with tools, it would take hours to cut through, he said. He didn't just lock these, he built them to withstand force. Whatever's inside, it mattered to him. His words carried a weight that silenced the group. The ledgers had already revealed a man who had balanced mercy and control, who had recorded debts and secrets with the hand of both protector and judge. Now, the locked cabinet suggested something more, a reservoir of knowledge or objects that Thomas had guarded so tightly he had trusted even his family with nothing more than a cryptic note. Eleanor traced the paper again, the phrase echoing in her mind. Knowledge is the only key worth having. She imagined her grandfather writing it, the ink drying under the dim basement light, his hand steady as always. Was it a warning? A clue? Or a test meant for them, the ones left behind? Daniel reached for one of the dials and began to turn it. The numbers clicked faintly in the silence, their rhythm oddly soothing. He spun them aimlessly at first, as though hoping the right combination might present itself by chance. But after several attempts, the lock held fast, unmoved by guesswork. He stepped back, frustration flickering across his face. If he wanted us to open them, he would have left the code, he said. He left the key for the basement. He didn't leave one for these. Margaret seized on his words. Then, maybe we're not supposed to open them. Maybe we leave them shut and move on. Her voice carried more urgency than conviction, as if she feared what they might find inside even more than she feared leaving the mystery unsolved. But Eleanor shook her head. He didn't build all this just to have it thrown away. He left the cabinets here for a reason. He left a note for a reason. It's not about a key. It's about understanding. She glanced back toward the shelves, the notebooks, the ledgers. Maybe the combination isn't numbers at all. Maybe it's something he wrote down elsewhere. Something we haven't recognized yet. The idea settled uneasily among them. Thomas's records stretched back decades, his handwriting filling page after page of ledgers and notebooks. It was possible, even likely, that within those pages he had hidden clues, combinations disguised as dates or initials, codes meant to be pieced together by those willing to read carefully. The prospect was both daunting and unsettling. To open the cabinets, they would have to delve deeper into his private world, to let his words and numbers lead them further into secrets he had guarded with steel and silence. Peter ran his hand along the edge of the cabinet and exhaled slowly. "We're standing in a vault," he said, "not just for tools or money, but for whatever he thought was worth more than either. He locked it away because he knew knowledge outlives us all." His voice faltered, as though the weight of his own observation unnerved him. The flashlight beam caught the paper again, the faded ink glowing faintly in the circle of light. Knowledge is the only key worth having. The phrase no longer felt like a casual note. It felt deliberate, chosen, a message aimed at them as much as at himself. The locks waited, silent and patient, promising answers only to those who dared search for them in the scattered records of a man whose life had been one long act of preservation. No one touched the cabinets again that night. They stood before them a while longer, each lost in thought, each unsettled by the idea that the greatest part of Thomas's secret still lay sealed behind cold steel. When they finally turned away, the smell of rust and oil clung heavier in the air, and the note on the cabinet seemed to watch them go, its words etched deeper in their minds than the metal of the locks themselves. When the first cabinet finally opened, it did so with a reluctant groan, as if the hinges themselves resented being disturbed after so many silent years. Daniel had spent hours the previous night poring over his father's ledgers, tracing numbers and underlying notes that might pass for codes. He had tried combinations drawn from dates, birthdays, anniversaries, years scrawled in margins. It was Eleanor who suggested a sequence of 3 dates all tied to 1948, the year engraved on a brass key and repeated throughout the records. When the final dial clicked into place and the lock released, the family stood still, their breath caught in the stale basement air. For so long the cabinets had loomed like sealed tombs, and now one of them was giving up its silence. Inside lay stacks of rolled documents, bundled with twine that had frayed with age. Daniel pulled one free and carried it to the workbench, laying it gently across the dust. The paper crackled as he unrolled it, its edges yellow and brittle, the ink faded but legible. The family leaned in close, their faces lit by the beam of the flashlight. It was a blueprint, drawn with meticulous precision, the kind of technical drafting that bore Thomas Whitlock's unmistakable hand. At first glance, it looked like any set of architectural plans, but as their eyes adjusted, they realized the drawing was of the farmhouse itself. Every room was measured and marked, every wall and foundation detailed. The cellar where they now stood was drawn not as a simple basement, but as part of a larger system. The blueprint revealed doorways bricked up, corridors sealed, and staircases that no longer existed above ground. Notes in the margins indicated alterations over time. Walls reinforced in 1952, drainage added in 1967, wiring rerouted in 1975. Thomas had not merely maintained his house. He had redesigned it, reshaped it, layer by layer, as though he were not preserving a home, but constructing something larger, hidden beneath its skin. Eleanor's hand hovered over the parchment without touching it, her eyes tracing the lines of a narrow passage marked in faint pencil. It led from the basement's far corner, disappearing under the yard and out beyond the boundaries of the farmhouse. "There are tunnels," she whispered, her voice edged with awe. "They run past the property line." Daniel unrolled another sheet, and then another, the table filled with maps, blueprint of outbuildings that no longer stood, diagrams of wells long filled, charts of the land stretching to the river. Some were surveys of the valley itself, the kind one might find in a town office, but these bore annotations unique to Thomas's hand. Shaded areas indicated voids underground. Notes explained soil composition. Arrows pointed to points of weakness in the bedrock. It was as if he had studied the land not as a farmer or a neighbor, but as an engineer designing a hidden system below the surface. Margaret's expression hardened as she looked over the drawings. "Why would he need tunnels?" she asked. "Why would anyone?" Her question hung in the air, but no one answered. The more they examined, the more questions the maps raised. Some of the tunnels were marked with distances and depths, carefully measured. Others ended in question marks, as though Thomas had begun exploring and left the work unfinished. One map showed a line running toward the old church at the edge of town. Another ended abruptly near the riverbank, annotated with the word unstable. Peter picked up a lantern from the shelf, unlit but still intact, and muttered under his breath, "It's like he was planning an entire world under our feet." His words carried no exaggeration. The blueprints revealed not just a basement, but a network, a deliberate design that extended far beyond the walls they could see. Eleanor studied the maps more carefully, noticing tiny numbers along the edges. Some of them matched entries she had seen in ledgers, the same dates, the same initials. It was all connected. The debts, the payments, the hidden records, now tied to land itself. She imagined Thomas down here night after night, drafting by the glow of a single bulb, measuring and recalculating, recording everything with the same obsessive precision that had defined his entire workshop. Daniel leaned back from the table, rubbing his temples. "These aren't just records of the house," he said quietly. "They're instructions, plans. He wanted us to know the land differently than we ever did." His voice carried more weariness than certainty, but the truth was clear. The farmhouse had never been a simple dwelling. It had been the surface of something much deeper, a shell for a hidden architecture that Thomas had guarded with locks and riddles until his death. Margaret turned away sharply, as if the sight of the maps unsettled her more than the locked cabinets had. "He was obsessed," she said, "while the rest of us were living our lives. He was down here sketching tunnels like some kind of madman. What was he building toward? What was he hiding?" Her words echoed to the basement, swallowed by the low ceiling and stone walls. The family lingered around the blueprints, as though standing at the edge of a revelation too vast to take in all at once. Each map pulled them deeper into Thomas's private world, a world where land and house, soil and stone had been transformed into something else entirely. The cabinets had yielded no treasure, no gold or jewels, but what they contained was heavier still. Knowledge of structures and designs meant to last beyond their maker. As they rolled the papers carefully back into their bundles, the phrase on the faded note returned unbidden to each of their minds. "Knowledge is the only key worth having." Now, staring at the fragile blueprints and maps, they understood that Thomas had meant it. His secrets were not locked away in the hope of keeping them buried forever. They were recorded in ink, preserved on paper, waiting for the day someone would find the courage to read them and step into the world he had left behind. The second cabinet was harder to open than the first. The lock resisted every attempt, its dial stiff with corrosion, but persistence and patience finally wore it down. When the door swung wide, the family expected more ledgers, perhaps more blueprints or maps. Instead, the shelves were lined with boxes marked not with numbers or codes, but with a single word: albums. They were smaller than the boxes of papers, lighter when lifted, and Eleanor carried the first one to workbench with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The cover was leather, cracked at the corners, its stitching unraveling. She opened it slowly, and the room seemed to lean closer with her. At first glance, it looked like any family album, page after page of photographs mounted with care. But as the beam of the flashlight swept across them, a silence fell. Every photograph bore the same strange alteration. The scenes were intact. The farmhouse porch in summer, a riverbank in autumn, a gathering at Christmas. Thomas was present in nearly all of them, his figure easily recognized by the broad shoulders and solemn expression that never seemed to change with age. But where others should have been children, relatives, neighbors, there were gaps. Each face had been cut out with precision, a small, clean absence where an identity should have been. Eleanor turned the page with deliberate slowness. More gaps. Whole groups of people stood beside Thomas, their postures clear, their bodies visible, but their faces gone as though erased from memory. In some photographs, only he remained, the rest of the image pocked with empty ovals. In others, one or two faces had been spared, though no pattern was obvious. The effect was unsettling, like looking at a puzzle where the most important pieces had been deliberately removed. Daniel leaned over her shoulder, his frown deepening with every page. Why would he do this? he asked softly, though no one had an answer. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, her arms crossed tighter, her voice carrying the brittle edge of disbelief. "It's grotesque," she said. "Who cuts out their own family from photographs? What was he trying to hide?" Eleanor lifted another album from the box and opened it. The pattern repeated. Decades of photographs, carefully preserved yet mutilated in the same way. Weddings, funerals, birthdays, all marked by the same silent act of removal. The scissors had been sharp, the hand steady. There was no anger in the cuts, no reckless tearing. It was deliberate, almost ritualistic, as though Thomas had been working toward some purpose only he understood. Peter picked up a loose photograph that had slipped between the pages. It showed Thomas standing in front of a barn, younger, perhaps in his 30s. Beside him, a woman's figure was clear, her dress patterned, her hand resting on his arm. But her face was gone, excised with the same exactness as all the others. Peter turned the picture over. On the back was a date, July 1948, the year again, inscribed like a refrain throughout everything they found. Miriam reached for another album and whispered as she turned the pages. Maybe it wasn't about hiding. Maybe it was about keeping. Her eyes lingered on the blank spaces. Maybe he couldn't bear to look at them. Maybe he needed to erase the people, but couldn't throw the moments away. Her suggestion hung in the air, fragile, neither fully accepted nor dismissed. Daniel shook his head, unsettled. But who were they? Family? Friends? People tied to the debts in the ledgers? People tied to the tunnels? The questions piled upon each other, none with an answer. The albums gave nothing but silence. The cuts were too clean to speak of rage, too precise to suggest carelessness. It was as if Thomas had tried to remove not just the people themselves, but the very memory of their faces, leaving only the world around them and his own place within it. Margaret closed one of the albums sharply and pushed it away. "He was sick," she said. "No sane man does this. We've been trying to see him as some kind of protector, some kind of gatekeeper. But this is obsession gone rotten." Her words were harsh, but they reflected the unease everyone felt. Eleanor remained silent, her hand resting on the edge of an album. She thought of her grandfather as she had known him, stern, quiet, a man who spoke rarely but carried weight when he did. She remembered how he used to sit alone in the evenings, staring at nothing in particular, as though caught in a world beyond the room. Perhaps this was the world he carried, a private gallery of memory from which others had been erased. The family lingered over the albums longer than they intended. Each page turned with a mixture of dread and compulsion. The faces that remained unseen seemed to press more heavily than if the photographs had been intact. Every blank space demanded imagination to fill it, and in that act the absence became larger than presence. The albums told a story, but one no one could read in full. When they closed the last cover and slid the books back into the cabinet, the room felt heavier. The tools, the maps, the ledgers, they had all revealed something of Thomas's mind, precise and relentless. But the photographs were different. They revealed something of his heart, and what they revealed was not wholeness but fracture. Whatever he had sought to preserve, he had done so by cutting away the very people who had once shared his life. As the cabinet doors shut with a dull clang, the family stepped back, their faces pale in the dim light. The basement seemed colder than before, and the silence between them sharper. The missing faces lingered in their thoughts, hovering like ghosts at the edges of memory, raising questions that no blueprint or ledger could answer. The discovery came from a trunk wedged deep beneath one of the workbenches, its lid stiff with rusted hinges that protested when Daniel forced it open. Inside lay bundles of envelopes, stacked in careful rows and bound with twine that had darkened to nearly black with age. The paper itself had yellowed, edges curled and fragile, but the ink remained legible, preserved by the dry coolness of the basement. Eleanor lifted the top bundle with both hands, surprised by its weight, and placed it on the cleared surface of the bench. When she undid the twine, the stack fanned out into dozens of letters, each addressed in precise, familiar script. The first envelope she opened was dated 1946, the year after the war's end. Inside was a letter written on military stationery, though the insignia had faded to a ghost of itself. The words were direct, not sentimental, written by a man identified only by his initials. He spoke of meeting Thomas in Europe, of things they had witnessed, of objects gathered, and promises made to keep them safe until the world was ready to know. It was not the tone of comrades writing to share comfort or memory. It carried the clipped cadence of men still operating within secrecy, as though the war had ended for others, but not for them. Daniel read over Eleanor's shoulder, his expression tightening as the meaning unfolded. "These aren't family letters," he said. "They're reports, instructions." He reached for another envelope and slid out its contents. This one was stamped with the word confidential in red, the ink still stark after all these years. The letter referenced shipments moved quietly through ports, the names of towns underlined, dates of arrival marked like orders to be followed. Again and again, Thomas's name appeared in the text, sometimes written plainly, other times disguised behind an initial or code. The family gathered closer as more letters were opened. Some were written by men they had never heard of, others by names that sparked faint recognition from town records and war memorial plaques. They described not only battles fought, but what had been found afterward, abandoned estates, hidden vaults, caches of valuables too dangerous or politically sensitive to be left in the open. There were repeated references to the trust, a phrase used with such consistency that it seemed to be the name of an unspoken pact. Thomas, it became clear, had been part of a network that had chosen to guard rather than reveal, to protect certain things from falling into the wrong hands. Margaret's voice trembled as she broke the silence. "Guarding what?" she asked. "Treasure? Secrets? Evidence of something the world wasn't meant to see?" Her words carried an edge of disbelief, but the weight of the letters made argument difficult. Page after page, decade after decade, the correspondence continued. Even into the 1960s and 70s, the same men or their sons wrote to Thomas, referencing meetings in quiet towns, sharing coded updates, reminding each other of their obligations. Eleanor unfolded one letter carefully, its ink darker than most, the words written in a hand more hurried than the rest. It spoke of betrayal, of someone breaking the pact, of items lost or stolen. The tone was urgent, almost desperate, warning Thomas to reinforce what he had, to trust no one outside the circle. It was dated 1948, the same year carved into the brass key, the same year scrawled across boxes in jars in the workshop. Whatever had happened then had left a mark that reached through every piece of evidence they had found. The letters painted a picture of Thomas that none of them had known. To the world, he had been a quiet farmer, a man of routine, attending church on Sundays, keeping his land in order. But beneath that image was another life, one in which he had corresponded with men across the country, perhaps across the ocean, bound together not by friendship alone, but by duty to something they had carried back from war. Peter set one of the envelopes down and shook his head slowly. "This isn't just history," he said. "This was a mission." He never stopped. While we thought he was down here tinkering with tools, he was keeping watch over whatever this is. His voice faltered as he looked at the letters spread across the bench, their words filling the space with the weight of hidden obligations. Daniel pressed his hands against the table, leaning over the bundles. He read quietly from one letter dated 1955. Asterisk, "The world forgets quickly. We cannot. Keep your end secure. The others depend on you." Asterisk, he let the paper fall back onto the pile, his voice low. They trusted him. He wasn't just keeping records. He was keeping something safe for all of them. Margaret, standing apart from the rest, folded her arms tightly. Or he was part of something that should never have existed in the first place, she said. If they were hiding things from the government, from their own families, what does that say about what they found? Her words hung heavy in the air, impossible to dismiss. The family lingered in silence, the smell of old paper mixing with the dampness of stone and iron. The letters had revealed another layer of Thomas's life, one that stretched beyond the valley, beyond the farmhouse, into the shadow of a world changed by war. Each envelope was a fragment of a larger story, one that suggested Thomas Whitlock had lived not as an isolated man, but as part of a chain of guardians. What they had guarded and why remained locked in the careful phrases and coded references, but the truth was unavoidable. His secrecy had not been born of eccentricity alone. It had been forged in the aftermath of a world where men carried home more than just memories. As they returned the letters to their bundles, tying the twine back into place, the family exchanged uneasy glances. The basement had revealed tools, maps, ledgers, and albums, each unsettling in its own way. But the letters were different. They carried the voice of others, a chorus of men bound to Thomas by promises the family had never known existed. In their words, the old man's silence finally took shape, not as solitude, but as the discipline of a man who had sworn never to let certain truths see daylight. It was Eleanor who noticed the wall first. She had been tracing her fingers along the stone, following the pipes that vanished behind the shelves, when the beam of her flashlight revealed a faint seam running vertically where no seam should have been. At first she thought it was a crack, one of many that spidered through the basement foundation, but as she pressed against it, the surface gave slightly, almost imperceptibly. She called the others over, her voice tight with both hesitation and certainty. Daniel set down the bundle of letters he had been holding and crouched beside her. The seam was there, faint but deliberate. The stones in this part of the wall didn't match the rest of the foundation. They were smoother, their mortar cleaner, as though this section had been rebuilt later, not laid down with the rest of the house. He rapped his knuckles against it and listened. The sound carried a hollow echo, different from the solid thud of stone around it. The family worked together to clear the shelves that stood in front of the wall. Boxes and jars were moved aside, ledgers stacked carefully to one side of the room. Then Daniel and Peter set their shoulders against the false wall and pushed. At first, nothing moved. The wall felt as though it had sunk into the very earth. But after long minutes of pressure, the edge shifted with a grinding scrape. Dust fell in a sheet, and the heavy outline of a hidden panel emerged. With one final heave, the section swung inward, revealing a cavity no wider than a closet. At the center of it stood a safe. It was squat and iron, its surface coated with rust, but still formidable. A heavy dial protruded from its face, numbers worn from years of turning. The sight of it drew the breath from the room. It was one thing to find notebooks and ledgers, another to uncover cabinets of blueprints and letters. But a safe was different. A safe promised something tangible, something worth not only hiding but locking behind steel and stone. The combination was not obvious. Hours passed as Daniel tried sequences from the ledgers, dates from the letters, even the number 1948 again and again. Each attempt ended with the same unyielding resistance. Margaret suggested leaving it, selling the house as it was, letting the next owner carry the burden of discovery. But Eleanor shook her head. She could not bear the thought of walking away when so much of their grandfather's life had already been unearthed, each piece leading deeper into the mystery of who he had been. At last, it was Miriam who noticed the faint chalk marks above the safe's dial. They were nearly erased by time, no more than scratches to the untrained eye. But when she brushed the surface lightly, the outline of numbers emerged, written faintly in Thomas's careful hand. Daniel tried them, turning the dial slowly, listening for the soft clicks inside the mechanism. When the final number landed, the safe gave a heavy, satisfying clunk. The door swung open with effort, the hinges stiff from years of disuse. Inside, stacked neatly in rows, lay a collection that made the family fall silent. Small canvas bags of gold coins gleamed faintly even in the thin beam of the flashlight. Bundles of foreign currency, crisp despite their age, were tied with faded ribbons. Certificates and bonds filled the compartment above, their seals still visible, names of long-defunct companies alongside government issues that might still hold value. It was wealth hidden in plain secrecy, not just a handful of keepsakes, but the accumulation of decades. Eleanor reached for one of the bonds and unfolded it carefully. The paper was official, marked with dates from the 1930s and 40s, values that, even adjusted for inflation, represented sums far greater than any of them had imagined Thomas possessing. She passed it to her father, whose hands trembled slightly as he read the figures aloud. Margaret stared at the gold coins, her skepticism faltering in the face of the undeniable. The discovery raised more questions than it answered. Where had the money come from? The ledgers hinted at business dealings, at debts collected and forgiven, but nothing suggested the scale of wealth that now lay before them. The wartime letters painted a picture of secret pacts and guarded trusts, But the safe's contents spoke of something larger still. These were not the savings of a cautious man. This was treasure, amassed and hidden deliberately, preserved across generations. Daniel leaned against the wall, his face pale in the dim light. All this time, he said slowly, he lived like a man of modest means. And this was here, sitting behind stone and iron. His words carried both awe and unease. The grandfather he had known had driven an old truck until it fell apart, had mended clothes instead of buying new, had eaten the same simple meals year after year. To reconcile that man with the one who had hidden fortunes behind a false wall felt almost impossible. Peter scooped a coin into his palm, its weight heavy and undeniable. The metal gleamed in the beam of the flashlight, stamped with a crest not of their country but of another, a reminder that this wealth had traveled across borders, across wars. He wasn't just saving, Peter said quietly. He was collecting, gathering, maybe guarding, like the letters said. They closed the safe again, unable to decide what to do next. The coins and currency remained inside, the bonds neatly stacked where Thomas had left them. As the heavy door shut with a dull thud, the sound reverberated through the basement, a reminder that secrets, once opened, could never be sealed as tightly again. The safe had revealed its treasure, but the meaning of that treasure, the reason for concealment, remained locked in silence, buried with the man who had hidden it there. The family stepped back into the dim light of the workshop, the air heavy with the scent of dust and iron. The false wall stood ajar, the safe secure again, but nothing about the room felt the same. They had seen too much to imagine Thomas Whitlock as simply a quiet farmer. He had been more, a keeper of wealth, a guardian of something greater than themselves. And the question that lingered now was not whether he had kept these secrets for his own sake, but whether he had kept them for theirs. The reel-to-reel machine was discovered beneath a canvas sheet, tucked into a corner of the basement where the light barely reached. At first, it looked like any of the other strange machines scattered across the room, metal frames, knobs, and dials dulled by time. But when Eleanor brushed away the dust, the familiar twin reels and spindles revealed themselves. The casing was dented, its once polished metal scarred and pitted, but it had been cared for in its time. A pair of reels still sat loaded, the tape wound tight, as if waiting for a hand that never came back to press play. Daniel crouched beside it, frowning as he examined the switches. The power cord had been wrapped carefully around the base, its cloth covering frayed but intact. When he ran his thumb across the plug, he saw it had been fitted with a more modern adapter, a sign that Thomas had been using the machine long after such devices had gone out of fashion. He hesitated, looking to the others before speaking. "If there's something on here," he said, "he wanted us to hear it." His words were steady, but his hand shook slightly as he unwound the cord. They found an old socket near the workbench, brittle but functional. Daniel plugged the cord in, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the machine gave a low hum, the reels vibrating faintly. He pressed the play button, and the tape began to turn with a slow, steady whir. A crackle of static filled the room, followed by silence, and then, faint at first, the sound of a voice. It was Thomas. Even distorted by age and the wear of tape, the voice was unmistakable, deep, measured, the cadence of a man who had always spoken sparingly, each word chosen carefully. The family froze as the basement seemed to close around them, the darkness pressing in while the machine carried the sound of their grandfather back into the room. "If you are hearing this," the recording began, "then I am gone. That is how it was meant to be." The pause that followed was long, heavy with the static of silence. Then he continued, "I have made mistakes, choices that cannot be undone. I thought I could carry them alone, but no man carries away the past without it pressing into future." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes glistening. Margaret stood rigid, her arms locked against her chest, as though bracing herself against words she had no power to stop. Thomas's voice pressed on. "After the war, we found things the world was not ready for. Promises were made, sworn by men who had seen too much and trusted too little. We vowed to guard what could not be returned, what could not be destroyed. I took my part, as they did theirs. For decades I kept it safe, sealed beneath this house, watching over it so that it would not be lost, or worse, found by those who would use it. The reels turned, the tape whispering as it passed through the heads. The words were calm, but beneath them lay something harder to place. A regret, a burden carried too long. I told myself I was protecting you by keeping silence, that what I carried need not touch my children or theirs. But silence is a lie of its own. You live in the shadow of what you do not know, and now that shadow is yours to face. Daniel closed his eyes, hearing in his father's tone the same stern authority that had ruled his childhood. Yet now it carried something else, something human, something weary. Thomas continued, "You will have found the ledgers, the maps, perhaps even the letters. You will know, then, that this was not the work of one man, but of many. What we did believing it was necessary. Whether it was right, God will judge. What remains is yours to decide. You may choose to keep it, guard as I did, or you may choose to bury it. Let it fade into history as though it never was. But understand this. Once you know, you cannot unknow. You cannot step back into the life you had before opening that door." The machine clicked faintly, the tape stuttering before carrying his voice again. "I leave you no instructions. Only the truth I cannot speak in life. Whatever you do, do it together. A house divided cannot guard what must be guarded, nor can it carry the silence of burial. Choose and bear the weight of your choice." The recording ended not with farewell, but with the abrupt click of the stop button, as though Thomas himself had reached the end of what he was willing to confess. The reels slowed, then stopped altogether, leaving only the hum of the machine and the hollow quiet of the basement. No one spoke for a long time. The family stood in the dim light, surrounded by ledgers, maps, and cabinets, their grandfather's voice still echoing in their ears. The words had not given answers so much as handed them a question, heavier than any secret they had unearthed. It was no longer only about what Thomas had done or why. It was about what they, standing in his place, would do now. Eleanor finally reached forward and switched the machine off. The silence that followed felt almost unbearable, as if the walls themselves were waiting for them to decide. The journal was small, bound in leather that had darkened to near black with age, its edges frayed from years of being opened and shut by careful hands. Eleanor discovered it inside a wooden box tucked beneath the cabinet of photographs, almost hidden in the shadows, as though deliberately placed apart from everything else. Unlike the ledgers, which were neat and methodical, this book felt personal from the moment she lifted it. It was lighter, intimate, a volume carried close rather than stored away. When she laid it on the workbench and opened the first page, the name Thomas Whitlock was written in steady script, followed by the date, January 1948. The family gathered around, the air heavy with anticipation. The entries were not columns of numbers or business records, but words written in full sentences, dense paragraphs that revealed the private thoughts of man they had only ever known through silence. His tone was steady, deliberate, but beneath it ran an undercurrent of unease. The first entry spoke of his return from Europe, the strangeness of walking back into quiet Vermont fields after years spent among ruins. He wrote of friends lost, of nights when the sounds of war followed him even into the silence of his own bed. But soon the writing shifted, and the reason for the brass key, for the repeated echoes of 1948 in everything they had found, became clear. Thomas described a pact, one forged not in official halls, but in whispered conversations among men who had seen too much. He wrote of estates left abandoned in the final days of the war, manor houses with their doors thrown open, vaults cracked, treasures scattered with no one left to claim them. Some of what they found was looted property, art stripped from homes, gold smuggled from banks, heirlooms torn from families who had vanished. Other caches belonged to governments that no longer existed, currencies and bonds from regimes collapsing into rubble. Official channels could not contain it all. Commanders turned a blind eye. Soldiers pocketed what they could, but a handful of men, Thomas among them, believed it could not be left to chaos. We told ourselves it was for safekeeping. One entry read, that we would guard what others would exploit. We were young and believed the world might yet be preserved from its own hunger. But in truth we were afraid of governments, afraid of thieves, afraid even of each other. His words were steady, but they betrayed the weight of a decision that had shaped the rest of his life. He named no one directly, Only initials, RHJKMS, but his descriptions made it clear these were men he trusted as much as he distrusted them. Together they divided the caches, each man taking responsibility for a portion, vowing to hide it, protect it, and never profit personally. They called it a trust, echoing the very word used in the letters they had already found. Their task was not ownership but guardianship, a burden they believed necessary in the fragile years after the war. Thomas rode a transporting crates under cover of night, slipping them onto ships bound for America, disguising them as ordinary cargo. Once back home, he built the basement into more than a workshop. He reinforced walls, installed cabinets and safes, drafted maps of tunnels, creating a vault beneath the farmhouse where the pieces of that pack could be hidden. The key is not to wealth, he wrote, but to a promise. 1948 is the year we sealed our silence, the year we chose to carry what was not ours, because leaving adrift in the world would have been worse. The journal was not filled with triumph. It was steeped in doubt. He admitted to wondering, even then, whether they had only changed the form of theft, becoming custodians of things that should have been returned, not hidden. What right did we have? He asked in one entry. What claim could we make on lives lost, families erased? We told ourselves it was temporary, but time passes and temporary becomes forever. The pages stretched through the year, chronicling the early meetings of the group, the precautions they took, the coded letters they exchanged. By the final entry, dated December 31st, 1948, Thomas's words carried the tone of someone already resigned. We have bound ourselves to silence, he wrote. I cannot say if it was noble or cowardly. Perhaps it is both. But I know this. The weight of what we carried home will never leave us. It will outlast us all. The family stood around the bench in silence after Eleanor finished reading aloud. The words seemed to press against the damp stone walls, filling the room with a presence larger than Thomas himself. The brass key, the years scrawled across jars and maps, the hidden wealth. They all pointed back to this moment, to a pact made in the aftermath of war by men who had decided to guard the world from treasures too dangerous to be left untended. Margaret finally spoke, her voice low and strained. So he was a thief, too. No matter how he dressed it in words, that's what it was. Daniel shook his head slowly, though his expression carried no certainty. Or he was trying to keep worse thieves from taking it. Maybe both are true. The journal lay open on the workbench, its pages trembling slightly in the draft of the basement, as though the words themselves refused to rest. Whatever judgment the family made, the truth was clear. Thomas had lived his life not only as father and farmer, but as a man bound to a secret he could never explain. And now, with the journal uncovered, that secret no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to them. The farthest wall of the basement had always looked different from the rest. The stones were smoother, the mortar cleaner, as if laid by a hand that wanted to hide something rather than simply hold up a house. For days the family had circled it, their attention caught by the faint lines in the stonework, the way the wall seemed too perfect compared to the weathered foundation around it. It was Eleanor who finally pressed a palm against it and said aloud what they were all thinking, that it was not a wall at all, but a door disguised in stone. Daniel fetched the crowbar again, the same one that had broken open the basement door. He tested the mortar, and it flaked away easier than he expected. The first stone came loose with a groan of resistance, then another, each one falling to the concrete floor with a hollow thud that echoed through the room. The smell of dust and old earth filled their lungs, heavier with each breach, until the gap widened enough to reveal darkness beyond. Margaret protested, urging them to stop, but by then there was no turning back. The wall had been waiting for decades, and now its silence was breaking. When the opening was wide enough, Daniel shone the flashlight inside. The beam cut through a haze of dust, revealing a chamber no larger than a bedroom, its walls of rough stone, its ceiling low. The air that drifted out was colder than the rest of the basement, carrying the stale scent of things locked away too long. Against the back wall, stacked neatly in rows, were crates, wooden, reinforced with iron straps, their surfaces marked with crests and symbols that none of them immediately recognized. The paint had faded, but faint outlines of eagles' crowns and foreign lettering remained. Eleanor stepped forward, her heart pounding as the light swept across the stacks. Some bore numbers, others initials, all stenciled in bold black ink. They were uniform, military in their precision, untouched since the day they had been sealed. She reached out and brushed her hand across one of the lids. The wood was dry but solid, the seal unbroken. Nearly 80 years had passed, and still the crates had held their silence. Daniel climbed through the opening and stood before the first stack. He ran his fingers along the crest painted on the front, tracing its outline until he recognized it faintly from books he had seen years ago. "These aren't from here," he said quietly. "These came from Europe." His words carried no surprise, only confirmation of what the journal and letters had already suggested. The pact, the trust, the guardianship. It had all led to this chamber, to these crates that had crossed an ocean under the cover of secrecy. Peter joined him, crouching beside one crate to examine the nails that sealed it shut. "They've never been opened," he whispered. His voice held both awe and unease. The thought that their grandfather had bricked up an entire room to protect cargo untouched for nearly a century pressed on them all. What kind of burden had he carried, knowing this was below his feet every day of his life? Margaret refused to step inside. She stood in the breach of the wall, her arms folded, her face pale. "It's not ours," she said sharply. "Whatever it is, it belongs to someone else. Families, nations. We shouldn't even be looking at it." Her words echoed with truth, yet no one moved to cover the opening. Curiosity, heavier than conscience, drew their eyes back to the crates. Eleanor noticed one stamped with a date, 1944. Another bore the initials of a city she recognized, a place that had seen the worst of the war. She felt the weight of history pressing through the dust and wood, the knowledge that these were not simple boxes of tools or grain but relics of a broken world. Sealed in her grandfather's basement, as though time itself had stopped for them. Daniel placed his hand flat against one crate, his voice low. "This was a promise," he said. "This is what he guarded." He remembered the words from the tape recorder, the journal, the letters. A trust, a pact, a vow to keep safe what could not be returned, what could not be destroyed. The crate stood as proof that Thomas had kept his part until the very end. The family did not open them that night. They stood in the unfinished room, their flashlight beams moving from crest to crest, from seal to seal, absorbing the scale of what they had uncovered. The silence of the chamber was thick, pressing, broken only by their breathing. Each crate seemed to carry not just weight in wood and iron, but the voices of those who had been silenced when they were taken. When they finally stepped back through the breach, leaving the crates untouched, the wall behind them looked less like stone and more like a veil they could never fully close again. The unfinished room had been hidden for nearly 80 years, but now its secret belonged to them. As they stood in the workshop once more, the knowledge settled heavily between them. Their grandfather had been more than a farmer, more than a keeper of tools and ledgers. He had been a sentinel, guarding a chamber of history that time itself had tried to forget. The wall could be rebuilt, the crate sealed again, but the truth had already stepped into the open. What they chose to do with it would mark them as surely as it had marked Thomas in 1948, binding them to a secret that could not remain buried forever. The basement felt different once the chamber was open. The crates loomed in the background, silent and solid, their faded crests staring back at the family like watchful eyes. The ledgers, maps, letters, and photographs lay scattered across the workbench, each piece of Thomas Whitlock's hidden life spread out before them. The air was heavy, not just with dust and age, but with the weight of decisions that could not be postponed forever. For the first time since stepping into basement, they were not merely uncovering the past. They were being asked to act on it. Daniel sat at the bench, his elbows resting on the wood, his hands pressed against his temples. The discovery had aged him in the span of a few days, the lines on his face deepening, his shoulders sagging as though Thomas's burdens had slipped neatly from father to son. Eleanor stood nearby, her arms folded, her eyes fixed on the journal lying open to the final entry of 1948. She read the words again and again, searching for some clarity that refused to come. Margaret hovered near the stairwell, as though one step closer to the exit might free her from the responsibility pressing in from the walls. Peter paced, restless, unwilling to be still. Miriam leaned against a cabinet, quiet but watchful, her gaze moving from one sibling to the next. The silence stretched long, before Margaret broke it. "We can't keep this," she said, her voice low but sharp. "It isn't ours. It never was. Those crates belong to someone else, maybe to families who lost everything, maybe to nations. Hiding them for another generation would only make us accomplices to what he started." Her words struck hard, and for a moment no one argued. But Daniel finally raised his head, his eyes heavy. "And what happens if we hand it over?" he asked. "Do you think governments won't fight over it? Do you think it will ever reach the families it was taken from? It'll end up in vaults or auctions or worse." He guarded it because he didn't trust anyone else. Are we so sure he was wrong? Peter stopped pacing, his jaw clenched. "So what then? We just keep it? Pretend we never saw it? Keep living our lives above a basement full of stolen history?" His voice cracked with frustration. "That's not living. That's burying ourselves right along with him." Eleanor finally spoke, her voice quieter but firmer than the others. "It's not about what we want," she said. "It's about what we can live with." He carried this alone because he thought it was his duty. Maybe he was right, maybe he was wrong. But he believed it would destroy us if we knew. Now we do. So the question isn't what's right in some perfect world. The question is, what truth can we carry without tearing ourselves apart? The words lingered in the air. They thought of the gold coins stacked in the safe, the bonds neatly folded, the photographs with their faces cut away, the reel of Thomas's voice confessing mistakes and promising nothing but choice. They thought of the crates behind the wall, sealed since 1944, heavy with silence. Every object carried a different kind of responsibility, and together they painted a portrait of a man who had built a life of simplicity above a foundation of secrecy. Miriam stepped forward then, her tone calm, measured. "We don't have to decide tonight," she said, "but we can't pretend the decision doesn't exist. If we keep it, we inherit the trust. If we expose it, we risk unleashing something we don't understand. And if we bury it again, we live with the same silence that haunted him." She looked at each of them in turn. None of those choices are easy. None of them are clean. The family fell quiet again. The basement hummed faintly with the sound of pipes, the smell of rust and mildew mixing with the faint chemical tang of old machines. It no longer felt like a place of discovery, but of judgment. Each of them saw something different in the artifacts. For Daniel, it was duty. For Margaret, it was theft. For Eleanor, it was a question of legacy. For Peter, it was a burden he wanted to escape. For Miriam, it was a problem without a perfect answer. At last, Daniel rose from the bench and closed the journal. He held it in his hands a moment longer before setting it back into the wooden box. "Whatever we decide," he said, his voice steady, "we decide together. If we let it divide us, then all of this, everything he did, will have been for nothing." His eyes swept over them, searching for agreement, or at least recognition. Slowly, one by one, they nodded, though none of them looked comforted. They began to gather the letters, the photographs, the ledgers, stacking them neatly, returning them to their boxes. The crates in the hidden chamber remained untouched, their seals unbroken. The safe was locked again, the reel-to-reel unplugged. For now, the artifact would rest where they had been left, the decision postponed but not erased. As they ascended the stairs one by one, the basement returned to silence. The lights dimmed, the dust settled, and the walls held their secrets once more. Yet the room was no longer the same. It had shown them not only Thomas's hidden life, but their own reflection, fractured by history, pressed against choices no family should have to make. What they preserved, what they exposed, and what they let rest would shape not only their future, but the shadow of their grandfather's past.